Welcome to Mysterious Mars. I came across this observation in the process of looking for something to make a cool flyover from, and I thought this would be good material for that. In the process of scouting this observation for generating a path to fly over, I stumbled across something that really puzzled me. From there, I discovered a series of clues that led me to a rather surprising conclusion. What I'm going to be doing here is taking you on that same journey and following those clues as I discovered them, and talk about the conclusion I ended with. I'm going to present about half a dozen crops from the larger observation that I've done some very basic enhancement on and enlargement of. In this first image here, we have a couple examples of this strange thing I noticed in this observation. That is this object here. We have a opening in the surface, and then we have a white streak of material coming out of that opening. If you look here, we have an opening in the surface, and we have a white streak of material, like a tail. You can call them a tail, I'm not sure what else to call them, coming out of it. Over here, there's an opening and kind of a tail coming out of it. Over here, there's an opening. It's kind of a wider tail here, but same ideas going on. So why is this interesting? Well, it's kind of odd or unusual, especially if you're thinking in terms of the Martian surface, that you're going to have an opening with something coming out of it or possibly going into it. That's kind of a bizarre thing to encounter. So it just kind of caught my attention, and I started looking around to see if there was more examples of it. And it turns out there is. Before we leave this image, though, I just want to point out one other item that keeps coming up in this observation, and that is here. So there's a number of perfectly round openings with a tube-like body, so to speak, behind them. And so I found that rather curious also. There's a lot more of these openings that don't have like a tube-like body behind them, but every so often I see this kind of thing occurring. So just another thing to note. It's not as common though as this stuff, whatever this is. In this image, we have another example of this phenomenon occurring. So we have a relatively circular opening. Not all the openings are circular, but most of them tend to be somewhat circular. And again, a very clear, light-toned tail of material or rod of material coming out of it. Looks like there's a smaller one here. It's kind of hard to see though. Just a quick note, something I should have pointed out earlier is that the bottom of the image is downslope and the top of the image is upslope. It's really important to understand that we're looking at a canyon wall here. So in all these images, the top of the image will be further up the canyon wall and the bottom will be lower down the canyon wall. That means that gravity will be pulling materials from higher in the image to lower points in these images. Okay, so moving on to our next image. We have, again, a circular opening with the tail coming out. I thought this one was particularly interesting because it has a 90-degree elbow in it. I thought that was rather peculiar. And these openings here seem to actually have like a dark material coming out of them, which is kind of different than many of the others with the lighter tone material coming out of them. So that's just how I was kind of finding them at first, just one here and there. And so I started panning around the larger image and zooming out and seeing if I could find more and more of them. And I very quickly did and was quickly overwhelmed with the quantity I was finding. And that's what I'll be showing a little bit of next. In this particular image, you can start to see just how prevalent they are. So we have one here, relatively circular opening, and a clear rod-like thing coming out of the middle of it. Got a circular opening, a rod-like thing coming out of the opening. You got one here, and a tail coming out. This opening isn't particular circular, but it's an opening with a tail coming out of it. Got one here. Looks like you have one here, here, here. Got a small one going on there. And if I even start to pan around this image, we can see even more. You got an opening again with this white tail coming out. Got one here. This is a relatively large opening. Got one here, here, down here. Looks like you kind of got one going on. And so I began to realize they're just kind of all over the place in this observation. So, and here's an even larger collection of them. As you can see, there's far too many to try to show or even try to count. I have a couple of really zoomed in crops here just to provide you a better look at these openings. So what exactly is it that we're looking at here? The best frame of reference I probably would have for this is, or what it reminds me of, is when you're driving on the interstate in the winter and you drive past a rock formation where they had to blast the rock away and make a cut in a small hill or mountainside, and you have a sheer rock exposure. And in the winter, the water seeping out of the rocks freezes, and you get those nice big, like, sheets of ice and icicles, although it tends to be just more big blobs of ice. That's the closest thing I can think of to what we're like. All of these things are water that has seeped out of the surface, the rock here, and has frozen in these large masses. But I'm not quite sure why you get these so well defined rods sticking out like this. I'm not quite sure what would cause that exactly. What we've been looking at thus far is the first type of clue as to what exactly is going on here. And we have two more, this image here being the next one I wanted to talk about. What we're looking at here is a row of small craters. And the reason I'm pointing them out is because they all have beards. And what I mean by beards is the kind of pointy patch of white material at the base of each of them. Remember that the bottom of the image is downslope. We're going to do a little flyover of them, and you'll be able to see the beards much more clearly. So that was the bearded craters. And our final clue as to what's going on here is this. Here we have very large openings with a lot of white material spilling out of them. Okay, so what exactly is going on here? This image makes it extremely obvious, and I also pretty much already just gave it away. We're very clearly looking at ice here. This is frozen water, and yes, I understand that everyone knows what ice is, but the significance is that it means there's large amounts of water in this region. So, a single high-rise observation covers many tens of square kilometers. And so just in this one observation alone, all this white material in it is frozen water. And so there's a tremendous amount of water right here in front of us. Well, it's actually quite far away. So why is finding water here in these quantities so significant? And that's because there's a grand quest to find water on Mars, to figure out where exactly the water is, how much water is there, what form it's in. Is it under the surface? Is it liquid? Is it ice? Is it salty, etc.? It has been widely believed by the scientific and academic communities studying Mars that surface water can exist around the Martian equator, which is pretty much where we are looking right now. It was thought that because of the atmospheric pressure and the temperatures present in these latitudes of Mars, any kind of water that made it to the surface would quickly disappear, whether it was liquid or in ice form or either bound up in hydrated minerals. There is an article from the European Space Agency that was published in December of 2021 about their finding of large amounts of water near the surface of Mars in exactly this region we're looking at here. I've linked to it below. I highly encourage you to read it. It's quite interesting. So they only very recently discovered there's a lot of water in this region, but they didn't really understand what form it was in. They are making these discoveries from orbit, and so they really don't know the actual ground state of the water from the instruments they have to work with in that context. But here we've clearly answered that riddle that the water is on the surface in the form of ice. And the extraordinary thing is, this tells us there's an amazing amount of liquid water under the surface. And as soon as it comes out to the surface, it freezes pretty quickly. So somehow the water beneath the surface is being kept in a warm enough state to remain liquid. That is quite interesting. My next question is, why hasn't anyone noticed this or observed this was happening previously? I don't have a good answer to that. I think one of the possible reasons may be that people just haven't been looking at the surface imagery of Mars in a detailed enough way. And as I point out in my introductory video, having highly detailed imagery of the Martian surface is a real game changer, and it opens up a whole new aspect or understanding of Mars that isn't really possible otherwise without that level of detail. As they say, the devil is in the details. That really applies on Mars. With my enhancement methods and the higher levels of detail I can achieve, we really can start to see that the devil's been very busy on Mars, so to speak. And there's a lot going on there that has really escaped most people's attention. Okay, so that is the answer to the mystery for this episode. Most of my videos will not have answers to their mysteries, but this one kind of did. So that's kind of cool, but it's probably a pretty rare thing. So that's all I have to say about it at this point. We'll probably revisit it in the future. Hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching. Welcome back. This is a brief addendum to the prior recording because after I finished doing that, I was just looking at my flyover video again and I noticed something rather striking in it that I hadn't registered before. And that's what we're looking at here. So we're at about time code 423. And what we see here is clearly a very large outflow. So I started noticing what was happening in this observation by looking at the very tiny outflows. And here we have an extremely enormous one. So you can see the water comes out of this opening here, and it has this whole fan of ice. So what's particularly interesting here is the dark color of the surface of the ice. Up here, you can see it's kind of pure white ice, but down here it's quite dirty. Even in this image, you can see it's detailed enough. You can see the baby outflows that I started talking about initially. Got a couple of them in here compared against this gigantic one. I should probably make a clarification that when I'm pointing out these outflows, I'm not saying that's the only ice in the image or that's the only ice on the surface here. In fact, the entire surface we're looking at is covered with ice. Everything in this image is all ice. And so I just want to make that clear because I think I've been focusing too much on just the specific outflows. But the water is seeping out of the surface just everywhere. And so we're looking at a complete covering of ice throughout this entire observation. I've just been focusing on these specific outflows because they make it so clear that we're looking at flowing water that's freezing into ice. But everything else is ice too in these images. I'm going to make a prediction here that we're going to find surface ice all throughout Candor Chasma, Valles Marineris, and at many other locations across Mars, because I realized I've seen these kind of surface features in quite a few other high-rise observations. So I don't think this is unique to this canyon area, but it's going to come up in quite a few other regions all around Mars. It'll take some time to bear all that out, but as I find it other places, I'll do some updated videos just noting the other regions in which I discover it. So that's all the additional material I wanted to present. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.